Hi, and welcome to Chapter 6 on Learning in Organizations. In this chapter, and I'm referring to the PowerPoints as I go through them, so that's why I'm looking down, we're going to look at what is learning, how does it take place, what types of knowledge are there, what are the classical theories of learning, and what are some of the adult learning theories. So when we talk about learning, what are we talking about? What is this concept called learning? I'd like you to think about things like, can we see learning? How do we know it's taking place? Is it happening right now to any of us? And if so, how do we know this? So we can define learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior or our human capabilities or abilities resulting from processing new knowledge, from practice of something, or from experiencing something. So learning isn't directly observable. You can't say, oh, I see the light bulb going on. Learning is taking place. Learning takes many forms, but it's the outcomes to something or the change that takes place that we know that learning has occurred. So there are different types of learning that we look at in this chapter, different ways that learning takes place. There's the one that we're probably most familiar with, formal learning. This would be instruction in a university or a school or a professional program. So right now, this would be formal learning. You're reading your textbook, you're listening to me, you're looking at your PowerPoints. So this is a formal setting. There's non-formal learning, which would take place typically in a one-off situation. So you might go to a workshop. I might go to a session on Brightspace, which is what I'm using right now. So that would be a workshop. That would be a form of non-formal learning. We also have informal learning, which means that we're consciously trying to learn from everyday life experiences. This could be group work, quality circles in the workplace, or when I used to teach the large sections of this course, it would be that I would have weekly groups and I would have representatives from each of the workshops, which I called the Student Advisory Committee, OBSAC. And that would be an example of an informal work group where I would learn from the students about what was working in the course, what they'd like to add, what we could do differently. So that was informal learning for me and for them as well, the representatives, because I would pass information along. There's also incidental learning, and this is a byproduct of direct experience or trial and error. So for example, I have learned the hard way that if I leave St. Mary's University after 3 o'clock and in the afternoon and before maybe 6 o'clock, I am going to take twice as long to get home. That I have learnt from trial and error and from experience. So don't take the bridge during rush hour would be another example of incidental learning. I'm sure you've got many other examples that you can bring to as well. It's important to know those terms and be able to recognize them if you see them in a quiz. A hint there. So how do we learn? Well, we learn through our senses. We learn through hearing, seeing, touching, interaction with others, physical responses. So these are all forms of learning that we take in. And what do we learn? What kind of knowledge are we taking in when we're learning? So it's important to remember that there's explicit knowledge, and that would be knowledge that would be handled in a formal work situation. So it's communicated from one person to another in written or verbal format. So that could be an informal or a formal a type of learning. Because I would be saying, this is what you do, this is what you need to know, this is a definition of learning, this is how we use Brightspace. So explicit knowledge is transmitted both through formal, non-formal, and informal learning because it's knowledge that can be passed along. coursework, as I said, knowledge with workshops. The other kind of knowledge that we have is what we call tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is different because it's usually learned through direct experience, observation, conversation, trial and error. So when I talked a few minutes ago about incidental learning and knowing when to leave the university or knowing from trial and error when to take the bridge or not take the bridge, this would be an example of tacit knowledge. So it's something that isn't communicated directly in the same way that explicit knowledge is, because it can't be measured, it can't be codified. It's subtle, and sometimes it's difficult to understand. So, for example, another example of tacit knowledge would be learning, and I'm looking down at my PowerPoints here, learning to bake, for example. So I like to bake bread. I can follow the directions, I can look at the pictures in a recipe book, but only direct trial and error will tell me if I'm making bread, for example, if it feels the way it should feel, if I know that it's reached that. So I can have instructions that will tell me what to do, but it's really only trial and error or tacit knowledge that gives me that information. Learning how to deal with customers would be another example. So I could follow the routine, I could follow the set of formula that's laid out in how to have a customer interaction. But maybe I add something that's a little different. Maybe I know how to respond to things, and that comes from tacit knowledge and experience over time. Okay, so those are two different things, and I've given you some examples with Xerox technicians and tacit knowledge. So we will move on from there and look at classic learning theories. And one that I do spend quite a bit of time on, that's not spent so much time on in the textbook, so it's important that you look at the PowerPoints and you pay attention, is learning through reinforcement, or the behavioral approach to learning theory. It goes by different names and it has different roots to it. You can look at it in your notes and in your PowerPoints. But learning is explained basically with this reinforcement model in terms of our interaction with the environment. So what we get out of the environment, what we put in, what we get back. So human thoughts are not so important in this particular model, but we learn to operate the environment in order to achieve certain outcomes. And reinforcers are used to increase the probability of this response. So a typical example of this would be Pavlov's classical conditioning, Skinner's operant learning, if you've done psychology courses. So I have an example in the PowerPoints on learning through reinforcement. But what I want you to take away from this, and what I want you to know with this particular model, is the schedules of reinforcement and what they do. So in order to increase or maintain behavior, and it's key to remember, what do you want to do with the behavior? What is it that you're trying to achieve? And there's a chart in the text that will explain this. So if you want to increase or maintain a behavior, you would add positive reinforcement, which would be something like praise, a bonus, or you would remove negative reinforcement, which is something that is not welcome. So we'll differentiate between negative reinforcement and punishment in just a moment. But remember, if you want employees, say I'm in the classroom and people are showing up late for my class. So I want to increase on-time performance in the classroom, in the workplace. Or I want to maintain the behavior of being on time for those who are already coming in on time. So I could do that two ways. I could add a positive reinforcement. I could praise people for coming in on time. I could give people a bonus point for being there on time. Okay, so that would be adding something positive. Or if people started to show up on time, I could, and I had been calling them out for being late, I could stop doing that. And this would be an example of removing the negative reinforcer. So I would stop the reprimands. I would stop doing that. Another example of removing a negative reinforcer in a different context would be when you get in the car. What happens when you get in the car and you turn the car on? As soon as you put your seatbelt on, the buzzer stops. That is an example of removing negative reinforcement. If you get in and you don't put your seatbelt on, at least in my car, it beeps until I put that on. So I put it on, and the negative reinforcer is removed. Okay. I was in Singapore many years ago, and I was in a taxi, and it kept beeping as we speeded up. And I realized that this was happening because the taxi driver was going over the speed limit. So he immediately slowed down, and when he slowed down, the beeping stopped. That's an example, again, of removing the negative reinforcer because the rules required that you stay within the speed limit. So we wanted to maintain that behavior of operating within the speed limit. Okay? All right, to decrease behavior, so in the other one we wanted to increase. To decrease behavior, there are two ways, according to the schedule of reinforcement, that we can do this. We can punish someone, or we can ignore someone. So punishment means that we either add or remove a consequence. So we could say to someone, okay, I'm punishing you, I'm adding extra workload to what you're doing, I'm adding extra chores, I'm adding something that is seen as undesirable. Or we could remove something that is seen as desirable. So I'm taking away the benefits, you're grounded, you don't have a pass this week, your bonus is removed, whatever. Now, punishment and negative reinforcement often get confused because they both have negative consequences. So to go back to what I said previously, it depends on what you're trying to do. So if you are trying to increase a behavior, you will stop negative reinforcement. So you'll stop nagging, the seatbelt sign or the seatbelt buzzer will stop. But if you have done something wrong and you want to decrease that behavior, that is called punishment. So it depends on when it happens and what it is you're trying to do. It might take a little while to let that sink in, but think about it in your own terms within your own examples. Extinction, on the other hand, is where we ignore behavior. So if somebody has done something and you really don't want it and it's undesirable, you ignore it in the hopes that the attention won't be reinforcing and the behavior will disappear. So you have someone in the workplace that's very disruptive. Maybe they're not doing their job, or they're going around and they're talking too much to other people. If you just ignore it, after a while, that behavior, it should stop according to the model of reinforcement. Temper tantrums in children when they're young, if you pay no attention, which is sometimes hard to do, and you don't give the attention, the idea is that you will extinguish the behavior by ignoring the behavior. Okay, so in your text, in your PowerPoints, there is a summary of the contingencies, a nice summary which tells you what you want to do and how you will achieve that to increase, to maintain, or decrease positive, negative, punishment, extinction, or ignore. So you can have a look at that and follow through. There are some examples. I'm just scrolling through here. Then we know what types of reinforcers there are, but then we have schedules of reinforcement. So schedules of positive reinforcement, the first schedule and the hardest one to extinguish would be continuous reinforcement. So rewards are administered, and it sounds very technical, rewards are administered each time a desired behavior occurs. Okay? So you would do this if you were trying to change behavior quickly and to maintain a desired response. So for example, if I was, as I said, wanting people to show up on time for class or reinforce promptness in the workplace, I might have a bonus, or I might have, let's say I decide that I'll have treats or donuts in the classroom if you show up on time. Okay, so I give those out and I do it every time you show up on time. Well, after a while, that could become boring perhaps, or not wanted. You might want something else. So you might want to switch to a different kind of reinforcement, one that is more motivating. And as well, if I stop that, you're going to figure out pretty quickly after a couple of times that there's nothing more in it for you, so the behavior may stop. So if I say, okay, bonus points, which is desirable for everybody who comes to class on time, and I do it for 2 weeks and then I stop it, you may think, okay, well, I'm not going to get those points, so I'm not going to go anymore. Now, that raises an interesting point, because you could say, well, you come to class because you get the benefit of having the lectures explained, and that in itself is reinforcing and motivating. So that would be a different kind of reinforcement. That would be an intrinsic reinforcement, that you maybe feel that you're getting more out of that. So it depends. Well, I shouldn't say that, because that's still giving you something. But there are two kinds of reinforcers here. One that is given from someone else. So if I give you the bonus points or I give you the donuts, that's an extrinsic motivator. And we get more into that in later chapters when we look at motivation. But if you feel good that you have learned by being there and you feel good about yourself, that is usually powerful, and that's an intrinsic motivator. But we'll get more to that later on. Okay, so there are different, and I know I'm whipping through these pretty quickly here. There are different schedules of reinforcement to look at as well, which I go into in more detail than in the textbook. So consider this important, all that I'm mentioning here. There is the fixed interval schedule of reinforcement. So that means that reinforcers are given after a fixed amount of time. So for example, every 2 weeks you get a paycheck. You know that you're going to get that paycheck every 2 weeks. It isn't usually contingent on any direct or particular behavior or increased behavior. As long as you do your job and do what you're supposed to do, you're going to get that paycheck. So performance usually increases just before the reinforcement and can tend to slow down right after. But you know that that is going to happen. So you might think, okay, I'm having a test. I know I'm having a test after 2 weeks. So I know when my tests are scheduled for this term. So right before the test, what would you tend to do? You would tend to, I hope you would be doing it all the time, but you're going to study harder before the test. And right after the test, your behavior may lessen a little bit, because you know that the next test is in 2 weeks' time or whatever. So you will pick up for that. So those have consequences when we look at workplace behavior. All of these do, and how you can manage what you're doing in the workplace to control the behavior. Variable interval means that you're not really sure when the rewards are going to be administered. It's going to be a variable time interval. So your performance is going to tend to be more steady with this kind of schedule, because you're not sure when this is going to happen. So an example of this would be promotion. So if you're in a workplace and you're not sure when you could be promoted, that there's always a chance you could be promoted, but it would be at an interval schedule, you will keep up a fairly consistent level of performance. Pop quizzes can be an example of this. So I might say that we'll have pop quizzes will be done at random times throughout this course. I don't tell you how many, and I don't tell you when. I just say at random times. So hopefully you'll tend to be prepared for them at all times, because you're not sure when they're going to occur. So those are intervals. Those are time frame reinforcements. But we also have ratio, a schedule of ratio performances. So the first one is a fixed ratio. So reinforcement is given after a fixed number of responses. So high performance comes in spurts to achieve these outcomes. So let's say that, that assembly line work would be an example of that. But let's say that you get a reinforcement or a bonus in the workplace for every 10 customers that sign up for whatever plan. So you're at 8 customers. So you're going to speed up because you only need 2 more. So you know that after 10 customers, you will get a bonus. Loyalty cards are like this. So if you go to a coffee shop and after every 10th coffee, the 11th one is free, you'll tend to speed up a little more as you get closer to it. And these, because you know that you have to achieve so many in order to do it. Piece rate work is this. So if you're out and you're picking strawberries in the summer and that's your summer job, or picking fruit and you know that you get rewarded after so many boxes or crates of berries, you'll work towards achieving that. And finally, the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. Now this one says there are no particular number of responses before the reinforcement is given. It's based on an average. So I could say that there are going to be 3 pop quizzes this term. Not that I'm giving pop quizzes throughout the term, because I wouldn't tell you how many, but there are going to be 3 pop quizzes, and you don't know when they're going to be. So again, that would result in a high level of performance. Commissionable sales, so people get paid, so you get phone calls, or I used to get phone calls at home with people trying to sell me things. I used to get them usually early in the morning or at dinner time, and I would think, why do they keep calling? I wonder if they get any sales on this. Well, on a variable ratio schedule, you could argue that yes, they do. So they don't know when they're going to get them, but they know that the more people that they call, the more chances they have of increasing their sales and getting rewarded. Gambling, and those gambling machines they have, they know that the machines will pay out sooner or later, but it's not going to pay out on a fixed ratio schedule. So you pull the crank or whatever it is you do, and every 5th time it pays out. Well, that wouldn't work. It might work for the person who's gambling, but it wouldn't work for the owners of the casinos. But it's on a schedule that you know that it will pay out, you just don't know when. So that's another example of that. So these are really important to know, and you can see how, you'll see when we start talking about motivation in Chapter 7, how we use them then as well. Because in the workplace, the idea is to create a workplace that is motivational, that's meaningful for employers and employees, and what are some of the ways that you can do that to find systems that are going to work. So there will be questions on the test on that, so I urge you to pay attention. Okay, learning through feedback as opposed to learning through reinforcement is another method that we talk about. I'm not going to go into these too deeply because they are in your text and they are in your PowerPoints. Learning through observation, modeling and observing the behavior of others, so social learning approach. There are some examples in there. Adult learning theories, you should know the theories of adult learning, and sociocultural learning theories. So they're all in there. You should learn about them and you should know about them. There is a learning exercise that I give you in the text, and I ask you to explain what some of the issues are. That will come up, and there'll be more for that particular chapter. So have a good week, and thank you.